Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Ethics of Now from Home, our series of community conversations about the world that we're living in and how we're living in it, sponsored by the Keenan Institute for Ethics. We're continuing to do these conversations from home because the move into our homes and the pandemic that has caused it has highlighted the importance of thinking deliberately about community, how it's made, how it's sustained, and our responsibilities to one another in it. So that's what we're doing. Tonight, we're actually going to talk about a topic that we've labeled In Defense of Terrible Television, but I should say that we might talk about all kinds of television, terrible and not. We're going to talk for about 35 or 40 minutes. At 7:40, we'll turn over to you guys for your question and answer, for the question and answer period. The Q&A function is, or I'm sorry, put your questions in the Q&A section. The chat function is disabled, but Q&A should work. Folks at Keenan will collate them and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. I should say you're only going to see me and our guest, but I will know you're there, and we'll be talking to you as well as to one another. There's also a host of folks from the Keenan Institute working in the background in case we have any technical difficulties. I say this as I hear thunder roiling out of my office window. So it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome for the conversation In Defense of Terrible Television, my colleague, Mark Anthony Neal. Mark Anthony Neal is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies and chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, as well as the founding director of the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship at Duke. At Duke, he teaches classes in Black masculinity, in popular culture, and the digital humanities, including signature courses on Michael Jackson and the Black performance tradition, as well as the history of hip hop, which he co-teaches with Grammy award-winning producer Ninth Wonder. And if that is not enough, he is also the co-director of the Duke Council on Race and Ethnicity and the author of several books, including What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Popular Culture, Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities, and Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture and the Postal Aesthetic. His book, The New Black Man, was recently published in the 10th anniversary edition, and he's the co-editor of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader. Additionally, he's the host of the video webcast Left of Black, which is produced in collaboration with the John Hope Franklin Center here at Duke. If you don't follow it, if you don't watch it, you should. And you can follow him on Twitter at New Black Man, where he is continuing to do important public, but also quite intellectual work. I mean, so a lot of people that we bring on are busy, but you're busy on a scale that I find mind-boggling.
Yeah, it feels
And you
like
can't
that
say that
sometimes.
thing where I'm like, oh, but his children are grown, so that's why he's got time. You're just busy.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the things my parents endowed me with, this kind of notion that you got to work all the time. And COVID has been an interesting change. Trying to figure out
Right.
how to balance that ethic, if you will, with the reality that so much has just slowed down.
Yeah. Yeah, my parents tried to imbue me with that, and every once in a while they shake their heads in consternation because I still, and this is this will be the transition to our conversation, but I remember the moment, that was maybe summer, late elementary school, when my mother said to me, Adrienne, you cannot watch more than 3 hours of television on any given day. And I was like, Mama, that's crazy. If I do 3 hours, that only gets me Leave It to Beaver, The Brady Bunch, maybe the A Team, if you let me stay up. And, I think I can't remember like 2 game shows and I'm out. That's nothing, right? So I have been this person this TV had for as long as I can remember. But one of the shifts for me in everybody being at home and with COVID-19 is suddenly becoming acutely aware of how much TV I still watch or can when left to my own devices, right? When my office doesn't let me. But then also the kind of what feels sometimes like the disjuncture between the intensity and the sobriety of what's happening in the world and the fact that like I need to see The Masked Singer every Wednesday night.
Yeah, I remember growing up watching television, and the biggest thing is when my parents got me my own television. And then at some point it got upgraded to like a little 12-inch color television. But so much of my life revolved around television and so much of family life. I have lots of memories of watching television with my dad, for instance. In this new moment with all these different platforms, one of the things that's so striking to me is that, I'll be in the house, particularly during this moment, 8 o'clock at night. And if the four of us in the house, we're all four watching something different. And maybe only two of us are actually watching on an actual television, right? Somewhere else we're watching on a computer or on an iPad or a phone or what have you. So it's like we have all of this amazing content now, but it's also siloed off, for particular kinds of audiences. And there's not, in a way in which, if I think about growing up in the 70s, the way the Brady Bunch, was almost like a lingua franca,
Right.
for a whole generation of 10, 12, and 11-year-olds. We don't have that kind of television programming anymore.
So do you think it's the case that, I mean, one, do you guys talk to each other about what you're watching, even if it's not the same thing? And then are there still shows that are cultural touchstones?
So it's complicated, right? Because the 17-year-old is watching 17-year-old stuff. The 21-year-old is watching 21-year-old stuff, but the 17-year-old kind of wants to watch that stuff also. And as we're academics, and so we can never just watch television.
Right. Right.
So
So nobody wants to watch it with us?
with us, exactly. So if I'm watching with the kids, it's like the brain, the academic scholarly brain is on, trying to deconstruct everything I'm watching. And it's a challenge for my partner, for my wife, because she just wants to watch television to be entertained, and I don't know how to watch television and be entertained. So us trying to find the show that both satisfies interesting entertainment, but I also find interesting on a different kind of level becomes a real challenge. But we've managed over the last 20 years or so to find, those 4 or 5 programs on a regular basis. That's our common, our common shows to be able to watch together.
What are some of those?
Well, you mentioned The Masked Singer, so that was one of the things that we've been watching. There's a really, really, really bad show that was on OWN, produced by Tyler Perry, called The
Oh, right.
Haves and the Have-Nots. And it's so entertaining, obviously for the melodrama, but for the reason that it's so badly acted, but apparently it's scripted for them to act that bad, because nobody acts that bad.
And I wonder if it's like, how I think it was Richard Burton who was drunk all the time unless he had to play a scene
Right.
drunk, right? Because it's actually hard to do. And I wonder if it's hard to act as if you're acting badly.
Acted badly.
Right.
But definitely when Scandal was on, that was the spot that we were, every Thursday night. And these days, in particular, All Rise, at least for those first 19 episodes. And then one of the things we did, when COVID first hit, because that's the other thing, right? You got to sign up all of a sudden for all these platforms that you don't have because you have all of this time. So we signed on to the CBS Access and we started watching The Good Fight. So that's been a lot of fun, these last couple of months.
I want to bookmark The Good Fight because I don't have CBS All Access, so I can't keep up with that show, but I really, really like it. But I was thinking, so the Tyler Perry example, right, which I've hate watched a lot of Tyler Perry. I'm sorry, Mr. Perry or Mr. Perry fans if you're out there. But I've watched a lot of Tyler Perry in my time and never like kind of enjoyed it, but mostly been fussing at it, but not turned it off.
Right.
Right. And I always try to
Right.
figure out where my line is. And I had the same thing where I was all in for a while on Empire before it exhausted me. And then my uncle was like, oh, if you like Empire, you got to watch Power. And I just thought, well, okay, that's just too ridiculous for me. Right. So can we find a line like if I call this in defense of terrible television, like what is the difference between so terrible it's perfect and this might actually just be bad television?
For me, this so bad that it's perfect is really how much energy I have to expend to engage it. Um, Tyler Perry, whether it's his films or his television shows, there's just enough there that's funny enough to keep you entertained. And you can always see what's going to happen. It's not like watching, Who Got Away with Murder, which I had to stop watching because I could not invest week after week to figure out
Right.
what was going on. That's not a Tyler Perry show. So it's just enough to be entertaining, but not too much that I have to invest in. And you mentioned Power. Part of the reason why I haven't watched Power is like I made a decision a few years ago that I'm going to pick 2 or 3 shows on my own that I watch on my own that I can invest time in. Because the last thing I wanted to do was to try to watch 2 episodes and then not get back to the rest of those episodes until 6 years later.
Right. Um, so here's another big picture question, right? I tend to start these conversations with the giant. I asked someone the other day, what is culture? And he was like, why? Why did you do that? And I should be asking you, like, what is pop culture? And then what is culture? Um, and so maybe it's that one, but then also the question that I meant to ask, which is, what do we watch TV for?
Yeah, I'll start with that piece. I think clearly, and this is hard to think of as a scholar, right? Because we watch television because we're looking for text, right? That we can engage on. But I think it's clearly a form of escapism. And I think that's been so powerfully the case, during this COVID moment where we're all looking for some place where we could go away from the cable news networks, away from the email that we're getting from our institutions, just someplace to disappear. And television has played that role historically, I think, for many folks. We mentioned the appeal to Tyler Perry. I mean, part of that for Black audiences is the opportunity to actually see images of themselves on a regular basis in all kinds of complicated and messy and troublesome ways, just like we can go see other shows and see more hopeful versions of ourselves, it presents a kind of wholeness. So I think, the one hand representation, but definitely the escapism piece. Some people watch television because they're looking for certain kinds of inspirational themes, that some television shows have. And then, as you've talked about, some shows, kind of fit into our ideological view of the world, right? And we're watching these television shows to kind of reinforce, right? Like I'm always feel conflicted about watching procedurals and particularly cop shows.
Right.
Like I'm a really big fan of Blue Bloods. One because I grew up in New Yorker, so the NYPD thing is kind of interesting to me, and it's also very well acted. But in this moment, it's like, why am I so invested in this cop drama, right? But
Right.
I can remember watching Adam 12, when I was a kid, right? I can remember watching the original SWAT series when I was a kid. So I've always kind of had that interest. And so, it's, thinking about things like NYPD Blue. My wife and I have just started, binging on old episodes of Hill Street Blues.
Right.
So again, there's something about the drama that's contained in these situations, even if you might disconnect from it ideologically, that becomes interesting and sustaining.
I feel like something like NYPD Blue or Hill Street Blues, or even, I watch a lot of Brooklyn Nine-Nine in part because I think Terry Crews talking about himself in the third person is funny every single time it happens, right? And also seeing Andre Brower in a comedic turn is
Right,
really
right.
just endearing, right? Um, but that's one where you're just like, oh, cops are such fun cut-ups. right? And that's probably true for some of them who are, but in these moments when so much of my academic work is about thinking structurally, not about individual policemen as bad, but about
Right,
the
right.
structure of policing and the purpose that it serves, to then have these narratives that give you the individual policeman that you want to embrace, right? Like, so I'm repeating what I said, what you said to me, right? It's
Yeah,
complicated, but I also think there's a difference between the layered narratives and dramas or what have you of something like NYPD Blue and something like SWAT, which seems to be mostly aesthetic.
right,
It's like super stylized exploding guns
right, right.
and no self-questioning on the part of the people who are making those guns go off.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about all the NCIS, series, and it's like it seems to go, off the same kind of platform, right? And it's like they reproduce themselves. It's like
Right.
dozens of these versions of the show. I think one of the things that brings me back to Blue Bloods all the time is that when all is said and done, it's really a television show about a family.
Right.
And generations of a family are trying to figure out, what this family thing means, despite the fact, this is the job that they have on a regular basis.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that brings me that I haven't watched a lot of Blue Buds, but one of the reasons that I'm happy that it's on is that I have an abiding love of Magnum PI, and it's still always on, right? If you turn on TV somewhere at 10 o'clock, then Magnum is Magnuming. Um, and that show was an interesting show that did its own kind of. I'm sorry, my phone is just going to ring until it stops ringing. Um, did its own kind of work too, because in some ways it was about settling the memory of the Vietnam War in such a
Right,
way, like
right.
if, here, I am going to um, mute myself. I might get you to talk, but oh, good heavens, it's the Durham Public Schools.
The public
Bookmark,
schools.
Magnum, you say something, I'm gonna,
No, definitely what appealed to me about, Bluebirds initially was Tom Selleck, right? Because he had such a presence on Magnum PI, and, then he kind of had his film and movie career moment. But, you think about those kind of CBS dramas, Friday nights, multiracial cast. It was something that was kind of interesting, I think, in the early 80s and mid 1980s, as it tried to look back and talk about what's happening in this moment, but also taking this character who's also trying to work through, what the Vietnam War meant to him. And a whole generation of folks who were attracted to that show were drawn to it because of that part of the narrative, right? But as you say, we get all these kind of shows now where you get the kind of aesthetics of violence, the aesthetics of nationalism, if you will, patriotism, and folks are drawn to it because it's like watching a video game, right? Except you don't have to actually be a player, in the video game.
yeah. Um, and then, I mean, there are reasons that I'm drawn to shows that might be equally as odd and idiosyncratic. I binge watched Murder She Wrote in 2016 because I just wanted a smart lady who solved problems, who like triumphed over bad guys and solved problems, right? It was an emotional need for what is, I mean, the show holds up surprisingly well
Yeah.
for those of us with old lady tastes, but it was
Uh,
there is nothing like more or less legitimate in that kind of engagement, I think.
so, part of my television habit is that, and this goes from when I was a kid, and I used to sleep with the radio on, I sleep with the TV on. Um, and my choice on a nightly basis is Golden Girls. And if I can't fall asleep, that segues into Frasier. And I've seen all 11 seasons of Frasier. There's never a time where I won't stop and watch an episode of Frasier. If I'm feeling a little bit more risque, I'll turn and watch King of Queens. I've seen all 8 seasons of King of Queens, but there's never a reason why I won't stop to watch an episode of King of Queens. And for me, it's about the comfort, right? There's a certain kind of comfort in these shows more nostalgia when we think about Golden Girls at this period of time. There's something about the kind of nostalgia of the perfect 22-minute sitcom that's not trying to do much, that's just trying to
Right.
entertain you and revolves around these very interesting characters. There's something very comforting about that I can fall asleep to every night, with this comfort zone.
Yeah. Um, I realized at some point, so had done Curb Your Enthusiasm, BoJack Horseman, and then watched a couple of episodes of Insecure. And I was like, I'm on this big, like very different representations of Los Angeles, but like Los Angeles as narrative and imagined space. And I was like, this might be, they started building on each other because you're curious to see how various cities or various shows evoke a city. And I was like, but I think part of this might actually be a need to see people moving around cities right now, right? What I want
Right.
is the social, like looking at the sociability that we used to have
Right.
until we didn't.
That feels nostalgic already.
Yeah.
What to see a crowd of people in the New York City street, on television, there's a nostalgia to that already. Like this thing that, you're longing for the opportunity to be back in that space and share the smells and, people walking by and all of those kinds of things. And I'm sure for a lot of people, television shows that are very specifically connected to particular locales, particularly urban spaces, that's an important aspect of television for them now.
It's funny, so I have watched seasons of Atlanta, but my sense of that show is that Donald Glover, who makes it, has a conflicted relationship to that city.
City, yeah.
And it comes through, and it then reminds me of everything that I love and don't love about Atlanta at one time. So I was like, you're requiring more of me than I want my TV to require of me right now. I don't know. And then, these are kind of positive, nostalgia or escapism, positive in some ways. You might say, does the moment require something different? But they are at least positive, like better parts of our personality, I'd say. But the part of me that watches something like Tiger King, I think is a less, you talk about the ethics of that, right? Like there's also like a exploitation TV of
right.
some kind.
Stuff that
right?
we know that we shouldn't be watching.
And
Let alone whether or not it's good or not.
Right. Like you can't even that even rubric doesn't apply. Like that conversation doesn't make sense in the context of what you're doing. But what do you think is going on? Why do I watch Tiger King, Mark Anthony Neal? Or why do people, what is the popularity of the show?
I think because it's so weird. I think we're drawn to those things that are kind of built not to be the things that we've been accustomed to watch on television. The same reason that we might watch The Family Guy, right? Because The Family Guy does some of that. It's like you're watching it, or what was the initial feel of The Simpsons, right? This idea that's like, this is not quite something that I should be watching because it is disturbing, right? And disrupting everything we know about what this exchange between the viewer and the television is supposed to be. And I think Tiger King did a lot of that for a generation of bingers.
A generation of bingers. So it's a different kind of show
It's a different kind of, absolutely. I think to binge the crazy is a whole different conversation than to have to live with the crazy on a week-to-week basis, as we have historically had to be able to.
It's like drinking your cod liver oil really quickly. You kind of taste it.
I'm thinking about this series that was on last year where people had to cover their eyes because of the birds. It was a Netflix series where folks were afraid that the birds were going to peck out their eyes. So everybody in the series is, it's, that kind of television crazy that we can binge.
Right. But is there something generalizable about the popularity of stuff like that? Or is that just, TV offers it, so someone's going to watch it?
I think people are always curious. When you get a show like that, I think folks were just curious about the theme. What exactly is this? And, the part of the reason that stuff is bad TV is because it's not sustainable, right? It's something, it's throwaway. We consume it for the time that we consume it, and we're kind of done with it. That the McDonald's French fry, when it's still hot, those first six fries
Right.
are the best French fries you ever had. After that sixth French fry, after the second minute, it's like you're sitting there going, "Why am I doing this?"
Right.
But yet we go back and do it again over and over
Right.
again.
Right. Right. Um, are there some shows that you think are good for thinking, either about now or just in general?
Yeah, and I was a Wire fan, and I always proudly tell folks that I watched The Wire in real time. That when it started in 2002, I sat through it for those 6 years in real time. And I still come across academics like, I've never seen The Wire, and then of course they spend the next 3 days binging
Right.
on the five seasons. Like, wow, this was amazing. But The Wire did that for me in terms of being able to think about, obviously not just what the urban landscape was looking like in a city like Baltimore with gentrification and all those kinds of things, but really conversations about identity, particularly sexual identity, Black masculinity, and I still think there are a lot of shows that do that kind of important labor. Some of the more important shows, because Oprah, when she developed OWN, she attached herself to Tyler Perry because she needed an audience and she
Right.
needed content. And the one thing you can say about Tyler Perry, he creates content and creates it quickly, whether or not it's good or not. But when she was able to kind of establish the channel, the network, and started looking for better products, and it was, so when I think about a show like Queen Sugar, which looks at this Black family in New Orleans, right, and the kind of challenges of both class and also this kind of historical legacy of working class communities and even enslaved communities in places like Louisiana. It's a very thought-provoking show. She did a great show, another show called Greenleaf, which looks at the megachurch, the Black megachurch in this particular era.
Mhm.
And it's not as serious, it's more given to melodrama, but it is raising some very important questions about the role of mega preachers in Black communities and where Black religion as a whole fits, in Black communities. And now as we start to see the versions of interracial mega churches, right, what that means for, a larger history of religious practice in various communities in this country.
Do you think that people carry, I mean, and this is something, maybe you see this because I'm not on Twitter and you are. Um, do people carry the kinds of conversations that start in dialogue with the television out into places to have other
Oh,
conversations?
I think they do. I mean, I think that's one of the things we first saw with Scandal. The producers of the show, the actors, very brilliantly utilized social media, Twitter in particular, to bring folks into the conversation. And so, that character from Scandal created a whole generation of folks who were thinking about issues like what it means to be a professional Black woman, what it means to what kind of relationships you choose to be in or not be in, what kind of complicity you might have with the state,
Right.
which was an ongoing conversation in the context of Scandal. Um, and I think we've seen that mature in television shows like Insecure, where I would argue the conversation about Insecure on some level is more interesting than the show actually is.
Hmm. Um, why?
I think the show can only do so much. I think that's part of the reason of it. But when you talk about a character or a show that pretty much is driven by 30-something Black women, both from an artistic standpoint, but also in terms of the on-screen talent, it raises all kinds of questions, I think, for Black women who are in that age group who are trying to figure out where they are in the world, right? And it's a diverse group of Black women, right? So you have someone who's still trying to figure it out, where you also have someone who's a high-powered lawyer, and everything in between, in that conversation. So I think, the show's only going to ever do so much because it's 22 minutes long or 24 minutes long. But
Right.
I think the conversations have been much more productive or even fruitful, right, than the show has been, over these last 4 seasons.
Yeah, so having just watched it, or the first couple of episodes last night, one of the things that's like I went in thinking I don't want to watch this because like being young was already exhausting once, right?
Right.
um, and it was another one. I was like, I love that none of these characters are flat
Right.
and they're recognizable, but they aren't shorthand people, right? But I also, for me, the thing that sort of bugged me out about that show was that I was like, I never had this dating life, and it looks really hard, and I find it stressful, right? Watching
Right.
30
Right.
somethings try to figure
Right.
out love in the age of like
Social
dating
media and
apps.
dating
Yeah, I
apps.
was
Right.
like,
Yeah.
I can't, I was, oh, you know, so that was one where I'm enjoying it, but it was a very personal response.
Yeah.
That was basically, Lord, if I hadn't gone to graduate school, I probably just would like, my most constant company would probably be like WEB Du Bois. Right.
I give credit to a lot of my 30-something peers and my daughters who watched the show, because otherwise I wouldn't have been concerned about it much at all. And I think that my kids, because they're older now, they've been kind of helpful. So, my youngest daughter, who we almost never watch the same stuff, but she kept pushing me, you need to watch Black Lightning. You need to watch Black Lightning. And I've never been a big comic book person. Um, and even if it was a black protagonist in this context. But I actually sat down and started watching the series. And what I realized is that because the series is so driven by a black father, that part of what she was trying to draw me to was this dynamic between this black father who's raising two black daughters. Right.
Oh,
So she was caught up in all the other stuff. And she's like, no, but I think you would get drawn into it because of this particular dynamic.
that's nice.
Yeah.
Because it also means she's thinking of you, right?
Right.
So it's like you guys are in separate rooms watching different things, but you
Right.
are present somewhere in her mind.
Right. It's like, you will like this, definitely.
That's very sweet. Have you noticed your students, or was there a period, maybe this time has passed, when your students were really into a different world?
Ooh, I mean, I would have been their age when I was into a different world, or a little older. I don't think a different world has gravitated to my students the way it felt for a generation or two ago. I think when they think about examples of what a different world did for them, it's Grownish,
Oh,
which is,
interesting.
and I've actually watched that. And it's interesting because, that was one of the first series for me that figured out a way to integrate social media and handheld devices into the narratives of the story. Um, and so, it was a little off-putting at some point, but I was like, no, it's no more off-putting than what it actually is to sit around a table with a couple of teenagers. Right, that's kind of like the reality of it. And so for a lot of those folks, for this younger generation of folks, it's a show like Grownish. It was a show like The Yard, which was on BET a few years ago, that talked a little bit about college life. For them, a different world is nostalgia. And it's still nostalgia, I think, for a lot of particularly African American audiences that didn't have the opportunity to go to an HBCU. Right. So it became this
Yeah.
really interesting and imaginative space. And you give a lot of credit to the producers and the writers, definitely Debbie Allen for her impact in the show, to try to make sure that it reflected real world issues, right,
Yeah.
in this sitcom setting in ways that I think we haven't really seen done on a sustained level since that period of time, at least around the questions of race.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, maybe the history students are looking for different things than the AAAS students, because the AAAS students are getting something that the history students aren't. But I had a number of young women, especially in my classes for a 4-year chunk, who were really into a different world.
Well,
And my sense was that they were nostalgic for something that they didn't have, or it was imagining what it would have been like if I had gone to Spelman,
right.
if I had gone to Howard, this is what the world would have offered me, right? So it's, seeking out is not just escapism, it's seeking out an alternate reality that brings comfort in the current
Right.
reality.
Yeah, and I think from a classroom standpoint, I definitely see a difference over the last 20 years between the kind of television references that I can make in class that the students would be able to get, and how there are less examples of those now. And
Yes.
again, I think that speaks to the kind of segmentation of the audience, and what people are watching and how they watch it. One of the shows that I loved the last couple of years was Nashville, and I virtually had no one to talk about
Right.
the
Why are
show.
you watching Nashville?
And part of the appeal for me was actually one of the characters in the show was such a complex version of masculinity, of white masculinity, that I had never really seen on television before. And I was kind of drawn to that particular performance, in part because the character itself was fascinating, but I also knew I would never see a black character with that kind of complexity, ever presented on television. And the way that I had to try to bring that together with my students was to talk about basically, Nashville was empire in Nashville. Right? They're pretty
Oh.
much working on the same kind of themes, but where one is, New York, LA,
Right.
and hip hop, the other one is,
Right.
Nashville and country music.
Um, so this actually spurs me to ask you a question that I once asked Talib Kweli and got shut down before I finished it. But did you watch hip hop growing up? I mean, not hip hop, hee haw growing up?
Ooh. So I remember Hee Haw showing up and turning past the channel, right? And again, this is a whole different kind of moment, media environment, where you got four channels. And
Right,
so if you turn past Hee Haw, particularly when it came on, there was not necessarily going to be that much else that you could watch.
right. And you had to turn past it, right? Because
And
it
you
was a
had to, right,
dial
because you
that
had
you
no
weren't.
choice.
Yeah.
No, I was aware of Hee Haw. My father liked Hee Haw because he liked country music. I did not watch Hee Haw.
So,
I watched my fair amount of odd shows for a black kid growing up in the Bronx,
yeah.
like the Honeymooners and stuff like that. But I was not a Hee Haw.
So I have this pet theory. I have nothing to verify it. This is bad academic work on my part, but I think Black Southerners watched hee haw, and
I
Black
would
folks
agree with
who
that.
did
Yeah,
not grow up in the South did
right.
not.
No, that makes sense.
Right?
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Um, the one last question. What was the last question? I was going to ask one last question before we turn to the Q&A, but since it fell out of my head, maybe I'll come back to it. By the way, spoiler, Talib Kweli didn't like hee haw and didn't even let me finish the question before
Of
he
course
was like,
not.
never watched hee haw, did not see hee haw.
and, and,
Don't
and,
talk to me about hee
and,
haw.
and hopefully he didn't question your blackness because of it.
Well, I mean, this is again the sort of nice thing about watching, like having the Issa on Insecure's awkwardness foregrounded, right? So the
Right,
variety of black, and the thing about being a black nerd is that you've never fully satisfied anybody about anything.
right.
So it's like you can question whatever I am, but here I am.
You
I don't
know,
have anything else to offer you.
it's funny when I was a kid, and I was so caught up into diction, because both my parents had Southern roots, and so I was really conscious of how I sound, and it would happen often enough when I was a kid where someone would say, "You're not from around here," or "Why do you talk this way?" And my response always was, "Well, I watch 10 hours of television a day, right? And that's how people talk on television."
Right, exactly. He's like, I'm training to be a newscaster.
Right.
But it's true. All right, we're going to turn to the question and answer part, and I'll start with the first one that comes in. You mentioned the comfort and nostalgia of the classic sitcom as a particularly strong example of TV watching as escapism. I'm curious about the rise of tragicomedy and sadcom as a replacement of the classic sitcom in shows like Fleabag or BoJack Horseman or You're the Worst. Why do you think they've taken off in this cultural moment? And what's the balance between a desire for escapism as a viewer and TV creators who want to make a point and address themes of grief and depression?
Yeah, I think part of it, and I'll go from the production standpoint. I think because of obviously digital platforms, and the fact that folks can take more risk in television, we are seeing a kind of bridging of these genres in ways that are useful. Because, for instance, I think about a show like This Is Us, which is ostensibly a drama, but there's a fair amount of humor in it, that makes it attractive to people. So I think for an audience that knows that it's already complex, in some ways the industry is catching up to where the audience is, and now has the platforms and the vehicles to be able to tell stories that kind of obliterate what we think of as genre.
Yeah. Um, and I think that the questioner is right, that the sitcom, that one of the reasons that a TV show like Blackish or its spinoffs stands out is because in some ways it is it's themes we haven't necessarily seen, but its format is incredibly
But
old
right,
fashioned.
right,
Right? And the same with The Good Place or some of those NBC sitcoms that I like, that they are just like, they're just owning it. Like, we're sitcoms and this is all we're going to do. And we're still silly. But there
right,
are a lot of things that are fabulous television that have incredibly funny moments where all of the laughter is tinged with, oh.
right.
Um, and you're right, maybe part of it is that as you can expect that people remember the last piece of the story that you told, you can layer on a
Right,
series of different
right.
kinds of emotions into.
I mean, because you think about 20 or 30 years ago, whenever a sitcom was going to do a serious issue, right? You have to listen to a week of advertisements about this special episode. No one really does that anymore because that's now embedded in what these shows are now. You think about a show like Two and a Half, Two Men and Half a Kid, or whatever the name of that show is. I mean, they killed off a
Yeah,
character in the mirror of the
right,
series, right? There's no way to
right,
kind of do that and not, deal with the reality of someone dying, that was
right.
in the cast.
I think that show would have been better if it had been called Two Men and Half a Kid.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I'm going to go to the next question, but I could keep thinking about this for a bit. What about reality television? This is a good question. I'm currently writing my thesis on Black representation on Survivor, and I'm curious about what y'all think if you've seen the show. For example, what advantages, disadvantages do Black contestants have both in the game and among the viewership?
Reality television. So I'm old enough to have been of that first generation of folks who watch MTV's The Real World.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And it was on cable, right? So, it had a little bit of kind of flexibility. And we all remember when Kevin Powell became the stereotype for the next 20 years of what an angry Black male is. With the exception of that and that moment where Flavor Flav had his reality shows, for the most part, I've stayed away from reality shows. But one of the dynamics that I think are kind of interesting when you think about Survivor and Amazing Race, they're not the same kind of surveillance reality television, right? They're doing something very different. I think Amazing Race has done so well in terms of things like Emmy Awards because there is something that's real there and doesn't feel as scripted as some of the other stuff that we're seeing. But what becomes increasingly appealing to folks, and I'm thinking about the various Bachelor and Bachelorette shows, is that race simply continues to be a kind of narrative and theme within these series that draw people to them, whether or not they're invested in the shows or not, because the race politics just seems so crazy.
Right. So I mean, there's a way, having watched season after season until I stopped of The Real World, it's like those first few seasons, people are actually just like showing up and being close to whoever they are, right? And then somewhere along the way, there come to be certain roles that you're supposed to fill that
Right.
even the folks who are like imagining themselves as part of a reality show are working to fill. And then producers who then, where they stop even pretending that they aren't trying to script it.
Right.
So there's this like level of self-awareness and self-regard that makes them completely bananas, right?
Right.
And then I think what you see in something like The Bachelor or The Bachelorette are people who've grown up with the assumption that there's a role to play, and that playing the role is
Yeah.
actually going to be, if not how you win the game, how you are remembered from the show,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like that's how you get the Omarosas of the world still in
Right.
your world long after
Or,
they've been on The Apprentice.
or Nene Leakes, right? When you think about the
Right.
Real Housewives of Atlanta, which again has utilized social media as a great way to build community and interest in the show. So race in some way gets taken off the table, except as the spectacle of race in and of itself. But gender then becomes this interesting kind of dynamic in this question about, what's happening in these series.
Yeah. Um, yeah, reality shows are a whole nother animal. And you're right, they're so different from each other that they're the category only partially, like if you say that you're talking about reality shows, you aren't really quite getting to
Right.
what you're talking about.
And however we feel about them, it helped to elect a president.
It did, right? Because who had thought about him since Home Alone 2 or whichever one that he was in,
Right.
right? Before
Right.
the question. The NYPD offered a deep commentary on many social and cultural issues. What do you think are some of the best modern shows that perform a similar role in society? Well, I'll go with you and say The Wire, which what The Wire did, what I always say is like it's the best sociology 101 class you can take while sitting in your living room, right? Because that is a show that is about late century capitalism or early 21st century capitalism and the different things that it refracts through and shapes,
Yeah.
right? And it's about racial capitalism, to use like Cedric
Absolutely.
Robinson.
Absolutely. I think about All Rise, even though it's in its first season, it is a show that really is committed to a more progressive view of the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, and all those kinds of issues, bringing race and ethnicity into the center of these conversations in ways that I don't think we've ever seen before, even up to the point that the season finale, because of COVID, was scripted as a court trial that took place on Zoom. So, I can't think of another example of a show that was so timely, in terms of capturing what was happening in that moment. I'm sure we're going to see dozens of shows do that, going into the next season. But the fact that they had the wherewithal to be able to pull that off in the context of that series, on a drop of a dime, really, was actually quite brilliant in terms of capturing what's happening now.
This reminds me of something that I like about The Good Fight, or at least the way that the show begins, when Christine Baranski's character, who has been the law partner on The Good Wife, joins this law firm of, like, basically the Black people law firm, right? High powered too, but Black.
Right, Black.
And she's been on the Good Wife. She has her like progressive or liberal politics. She's super Emily's List. She is confident that she is on the right side. And then The Good Wife or The Good Fight begins with her dropped in with Delroy Lindo and a whole bunch of other Black folks, and suddenly having to think about the limits of what she has understood about herself and her politics. So that's not to say that like every commentary on the show is like weighty, but just even that, what does it mean to decenter yourself?
Right.
And to like let somebody who you're used to think of working on behalf of be in the middle of the room.
I think about that first season episode with Delroy Lindo and the N-word. That so many people, when they saw the clip of it from the series, thought it was actually a real example of Delroy Lindo being on a talk show, discussing the N-word.
Which also speaks to the power of Delroy Lindo, right? That he's
absolutely, absolutely.
absolutely.
I'm so happy that he's found a vehicle to really show off, his acting genius, which he's been doing for so many years.
I'm also really excited. We're not talking about movies, but I'm really excited for the Spike Lee Black Vietnam Vets movie.
Yep.
That he is. So here are two questions that are tightly related. I'm going to give both and just try to retain them. the line of "to binge the crazy is fascinating. Isn't it a sad commentary on the intelligence of our community? Escapism is one thing, but aren't there some shows like Tiger King that are doing a disservice to the progress of people?" And that's people, I think, broadly speaking, right? And then the second question, which is a variation on the first, is what does the extensive viewership of a show like Tiger King say about where we are as a society? What is the line between mindless entertainment, which is so necessary to cope these days, and exploitation? And what are our responsibilities in relation to shows like these?
Yeah.
And do our responsibilities change given the times?
So those are great questions, and I'll start with the binging on the crazy for a moment. I don't think we know or we have enough data yet about what this kind of media platform is going to produce down the road. When you think about the way that we have historically connected to television series, been connected to series for decades in some cases, right? I loved Married with Children. Married with Children managed to be on television for like 12 years, which is pretty amazing to me. We don't have those kind of relationship with series anymore because, they drop, we binge them. There's this incredible craving demand for them. And the series will take a long time to go into production for the next season. It's what we're seeing now with Atlanta, for example.
Right.
The kind of interest that folks had in Atlanta 2 years ago might not still be there 2 years from now, because in those 2 years, there have been 15 other shows that have come along to catch our attention. And so I don't know what the long-term effect is on folks watching this kind of craziness on television, because it's just a different kind of viewing habit that I'm not sure we know what that means yet. In terms of what it says, for who we are as a people to consume this stuff, think about how so many of these shows have utilized social media. So how many people watch Tiger King simply because it was something that was trending on Twitter that day that you had no idea what it is, and you went to see it just because of that? I think what it says is that we're human, and in particularly in a moment where we're looking for outlets to not have to deal with the realness of our life, and in some cases the trauma and death of our lives, that if there's a group of people who have been herded to say, this is where the escape hatch is, that folks are going to go to that escape hatch, and questions of exploitation won't be on the table, right? In some ways, those are the questions that we ask as scholars, right? Because, we're asked to think about, why everybody went to that escape hatch.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. As a historian, or at least I became a historian, and people do this for various reasons, for two reasons. I'm really interested in narratives, and I am really interested in ways that one builds one's empathetic imagination. That doesn't mean that you fully identify with someone, but you're able to think through,
right, like
how they understand themselves the way that they do, right? And oftentimes TV lets you do that, like good TV, The Wire, sometimes mediocre TV, but with space lets you to do that. I mean, I grew up with my mom taping The Young and the Restless every day, and then we'd all watch it while we were getting dinner ready. But then there are things that hit the limits of my empathetic imagination. And I mean, I think this is where the exploitation question comes back, where I watch something like Tiger King, and some part of me understands the people who are drawn to work at the big animal, park. No part of me understands the kind of like mind-blowing narcissism that drives the main character, but it is fascinating spectacle. Right. And the narratives that he creates, because being at the center of everybody's story is really important to him, right? So he makes a narrative that he's designed himself for you to not be able to look away. Right. So maybe this is a dishonest answer, but I'm just like, well, it's Joe Exotic's fault I'm watching, not mine. Right. And then I'm going to ask this as the final question, because we are at 7:56, but it says, do you think that there are holes, topics, or gaps that are still not fully being addressed on television?
Yeah, I think always, because television is so driven by advertising. Even when we look at the Netflix and the Hulus and the Amazons, and I could go on and on of the world, we still have not gotten to a place where everybody gets the chance to tell their story in the way that they want to tell it. And the way that stories have been told, if we think about different communities, ethnicities, and races, one person gets to tell that story, and that's the only version of that story that gets to exist at any given time. We are not at a moment where we're getting the diversity in various communities to tell the diversity of those stories. I always remember when as a kid, hearing about the dichotomy between what we saw in quote unquote whiteness on television versus blackness on television. And it was Charles Dutton, the great actor who was in an amazing series called Rock, which you can't find any place, which is, is a whole other conversation. But he said, if you want to look at the complexity of white folks, because they were like, you're watching some ridiculous black sitcom. It's like, well, there are a bunch of ridiculous white sitcoms also. So what's the problem? And he always goes, when you get to that 9 and 10 o'clock hour, do you get to see the same level of sophistication and complexity of black folks that you see of white folks on a normal basis? Yes, there was equity, right, in the 8 to 9 o'clock hour. But once you got to the 10 o'clock hour and the 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock hour, you saw stark differences. And I think for the most part, we're still in that kind of environment.
Yeah. My mom used to not let me watch shows because she would say they were too stupid. And I was like, okay, this either means that there's sex involved or that they're like black people acting foolish.
Right. Huggy Bear, right? Huggy
right.
Bear and Starsky and Hutch.
Yeah. Sometimes both at the same time. And as a kid, it was so frustrating. And yet again, to the points that I get in some ways as an adult, her impulse, I'm not sure that I would do that, but her impulse to just be like, this is beneath us. And if this is all anybody's going to offer you, then you're not watching anything. And I'd be like, well, that is unacceptable.
And that's why we love Shonda Rhimes, because Shonda Rhimes created these complex black figures and complex figures in general that lived in the 10 o'clock hour, whether it was Grey's Anatomy or Scandal or, to Get Away with Murder. When we think about who Viola Davis was for the time that series is on, we've never seen a character, black or otherwise, I would argue, as richly drawn, that she was, for the time that she was on that series.
So the final question, which we're not going to answer, I'm just going to give it as a question that we can all think about, because it's actually a really fun exercise. Just to say, if you could develop a show that captures and accurately represents today's time, what would you create? What would be the plot line, and who would you cast? And I don't know that I could answer that question, but it's fun to think about a handful of writers, directors, or showrunners that you would want to give that assignment to, right?
Yeah.
And for me, Shonda Rhimes would be one of them.
Yeah.
And somewhere in there, I would cast Joe Morton just because, like, why not? That my favorite thing, sort of looking back on Scandal, was Papa Pope.
Right.
And the sort of dynamism and charisma of that. Okay, it is 8 o'clock, and you have talked fully and well, and we are grateful to you. Thank you for your generosity and your time.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
And thank all of y'all for coming out and for your questions. We will send out a link with a recording with a video of this within a matter of days. And we will be back next week for another Ethics of Now. So thank you and good night.